Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this really special lecture and session together this afternoon. My name is John Gartrell, and I serve as the director of the John Hope Franklin Research Center for African and African American History and Culture and the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library here in the Duke University Libraries. So just to give you a little bit of background on the occasion and why we are all gathered here. So the 2021-22 academic year marks the 25th anniversary of the John Hope Franklin Research Center. The Franklin Research Center, which again is here in the Rubenstein Library, will use the theme of Black Lives and Archives as the thread for a slate of programming and projects that will build upon the center's mission of advancing scholarship on the history and culture of people of African descent. Our Black Lives and Archives virtual speaker series will feature 4 scholars who were previously awarded research travel grants to come to the Rubenstein Library and utilize the center's collections. This return to the archive by each scholar will highlight the critical importance of Black collections as a foundation for new directions in the field of African and African American studies. So for our session today, I have the pleasure to spend some time with Dr. Brandon K. Winford, Professor of History, at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Winford is a past recipient of our Franklin Research Center travel grant in 2015-2016, where he spent some time in the Rubenstein Library looking at many of the collections here, among them the North Carolina Mutual Collection, C.C. Spalding papers, and a few others related to Durham's history. His talk today will be entitled Our Good Fortune, Black Banking and Business in Archives. His specializations are civil rights and Black business history. And his first book, John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and the Economic Struggle for Civil Rights, was published by the University of Kentucky Press in 2020. The book focuses on Black business activism, the Black business activism of banker and civil rights lawyer John Hervey Wheeler. And between the 1950s and 1960s, Wheeler was the Tar Heel State's most influential Black power broker and among the top civil rights figures in the South. Winford is currently working on a book manuscript provisionally tentatively titled A History of Black Banking in the New South since 1865. So for our time together today, I just want to encourage folks, if you have questions, we're going to have about a 40 to 45-minute talk from Brandon, and then leave some time at the end, about 15, 20 minutes for questions. If you have a question, I'd encourage you to enter it into the Q&A box, and our dedicated Franklin Research Center graduate intern for this year, or we will be reading those off, and then we'll sort of have a light discussion after Brandon concludes his lecture. And if anyone else has any further questions about our collections, I would encourage you to visit the Franklin Research Center's collection page, and I'll drop those links into the chat towards the end of our time together today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Brandon K. Winford.
All right, good afternoon. And John, can you let me know if you can see this, the PowerPoint screen?
Yes, I can definitely see it.
Okay. Let me go back. All right, good afternoon. So glad to be here. Before I begin, I'd like to begin by thanking John and the Franklin Research Center for inviting me here today as we celebrate the center's 25th anniversary. As an undergraduate and graduate student at North Carolina Central University, I'm glad to have had the opportunity to meet Dr. John Hope Franklin on a number of occasions and continue to be inspired by his life legacy and scholarship. Today, I'm going to talk about the archival research I was able to do as part of the research travel grant I received in 2015. In keeping with the theme, I've titled this talk, Our Good Fortune, Black Banking and Business in Archives. First, to begin, just to give you an overview, I'm going to talk about. I'll give you a bit of background on really one of the few times you get to really sort of reflect on the research process. And so I'm going to give you a bit of background on my journey into archival research in the Franklin Research Center. And then, or I should say the Franklin Research Center and the Rubenstein Library. Second, I'll provide you with a brief overview of the book, my first book, John Herbert Wheeler, Black Banking and the Economic Struggle for Civil Rights, which was the proposed focus of the Franklin Research Travel Grant. In doing so, I'll specifically talk about my research into the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives and its significance to Black business history. And I'll try as best I can to give a few examples of some of my favorite archival finds. And then finally, I'll point to my current book project and other publications or works in progress that have all been really informed by the research completed as part of the research grant. So I have a number of projects that continue to be usable. The materials I gathered from that research trips continue to be usable for those purposes. And then from there, we'll proceed with a Q&A session. So let me talk a little bit about my journey into archival research at the Franklin Research Center and the Rubenstein Library. I really began doing work in those collections while I was working on my master's thesis at North Carolina Central University. I was undergrad there, and then I worked on a master's degree from 2005 to 2007. And I had the opportunity to work on an MA thesis on the Durham Committee. It was called The Struggle for Freedom Begins Every Morning, A History of the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, 1935 to 1970, which I completed in 2007. Just a little bit of background on the Durham Committee. It was one of the foremost civil rights organizations in Durham, certainly, but also in North Carolina and the South. It was established in 1935 by a group of African-American leaders, including some of the officers with the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and Mechanics and Farmers Bank, and some of those institutions as part of the Black Financial Network. In essence, it was to serve as a community group whereby African Americans could use that as a means to fight for citizenship rights. And so their areas of focus included equal employment opportunities for African Americans, job opportunities, voting rights, so forth and so on. And so through this organization and my research, I really sort of began to look at these collections at the Franklin Research Center. I spent a significant time, as John said, at that time in the Charles Clinton Spalding papers. C.C. Spalding was the president of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. I spent time in the Rencher and Harris papers. Rencher and Harris was one of the officers of the Bankers Fire Insurance Company, and also the papers of Asa T. Spalding. Those were probably the three main collections that I, while working on my MA thesis, that I really sort of dived into and really got to know a lot about Black Durham. And it's through that research that I of course, came across John Herbert Wheeler. John Herbert Wheeler, between 1957 and 1978, was the chairman of the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs. He had spent several decades as the Education Committee chairman, working to bring about educational equality on behalf of African Americans in North Carolina. And so in looking at these materials, John Wheeler just continuously stood out, right? He's definitely chairman of the Durham Committee, but he also had his hands, which was so interesting about him, he had his hands in every aspect of Black economic life and just Black life in general as it relates to Durham, North Carolina, the South. He had a national profile, he had an international profile. He was really an interesting figure. And so I said if I got the opportunity, I would spend some time possibly working and doing a dissertation if I had the opportunity on John Herbert Wheeler. And so it was really here at the Franklin Research Center in these collections that I became interested in John Herbert Wheeler, right? Really, again, had his hands in everything. Was was the foremost Black civil rights figure in North Carolina between the 1950s and 1960s. One of the most influential African-American civil rights leaders in the South, among the most influential in the South during this particular period. Yet not a lot of people have heard of him. And there are a number of reasons why I would encourage you to get the book to find out a lot more about him. And I'll say a little bit more a bit later. And so at this time, as an MA student at North Carolina State University, I also began to have conversations with the archivist at the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company before the materials were acquired by Duke University and North Carolina State University, or the Franklin Center in North Carolina State University's archives, because I was interested in examining some of those materials. I had this conversation to see if I could gain access to the collections. I did have a brief opportunity during that time to pursue or peruse select materials in the archives, which were again still housed in the home office building at the North Carolina Mutual. But the holdings by and large were not accessible for in-depth research, at least for me at that particular time, right? Some other people might have had some access, I didn't. So I was really excited when company officials began considering where to place the archival material, because it meant that I was going to finally have an opportunity to review those materials, right? And at the time, I can remember I was working at the Southern Historical Collection on UNC's campus, and I can remember company officials coming there because they were having these conversations about where the materials were going to go. At the end of the day, I didn't, I just wanted them to go somewhere so that I could then have access to them. And obviously they ended up here. And so ultimately, again, I was just excited to have access, possibly have access to the materials. Before the materials were fully processed, and as you can imagine, it took some time, I kept in touch with the Rubenstein Library, with the staff to periodically check up on the processing timeline. And by the time I finished my dissertation, the materials were almost processed, but were not at the point where researchers could access them. So they were not open yet. So when they finally did open the researchers, I applied for the Franklin Research Travel Grant with, quote, the primary goal to examine the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives. Wheeler's father, John Leonidas Wheeler, became an insurance agent for the North Carolina Mutual in 1908 and was an executive with the company by the early 1920s, unquote. So that's coming straight from my grant proposal at the time. All right, so the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives. As you can imagine, this is a North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, for those of you who don't know, in the early 20th century through the mid 20th century, it was the largest Black-owned insurance company in the United States, and its tagline was that it was the largest Black-owned insurance company in the world. And so I assert, and I always say that the paper, since they've recently been made accessible, so the accessibility hasn't been that long for researchers, and so they're still a largely untapped archival resource, right? Which, in my estimation, hasn't really been fully utilized or realized since the 1960s and 1970s, when William Jesse Kennedy Jr., who at one point was the president of the North Carolina Mutual, he wrote a book published in 1970 called The North Carolina Mutual Story, a Symbol of Progress, 1898 to 1970. It was a forerunner to Walter B. Weir's book, which you see pictured here on the left, Black Business in the New South, A Social History of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Essentially, William Jesse Kennedy, even as he was an officer with the company, he was a sort of de facto historian of the company, right? So throughout the years, throughout the decades, he chronicles in written form the company's history. And so he wrote and published his book before Walter Weir's book. It's such a really, really great source because in many ways, he wasn't a historian. So he held tightly to the documents. And so what you'll find is that in many ways, many of the documents are basically transcribed in this book, but it's a really well-written, fact-based history of the company. And then Walter Weir comes along and publishes his book, Black Business in the New South, in 1973, I believe. And it's still basically is still one of the most comprehensive sources on the history of the North Carolina Mutual and the Black Financial Network, Black Business in Durham. And so it's a classic work, right, that is not only used to really sort of help us understand Black business in Durham, but it helps us understand the broader world of Black business. But during that particular time, it was William Jesse Kennedy Jr. and Walter Weir had access to these materials. But since the 1960s and 1970s, by and large, these materials haven't been examined by historians to produce the kind of monographs that Walter Weir and Kennedy produced in some of the work that I've been able to do in my current book project. Now, Leslie Brown, in her book, Upbuilding Black Durham, Gender, Class, and Black Community Development in Jim Crow South, she, I believe, as she wrote her dissertation, she finished up at Duke, I believe she had some access to the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives. But other than her, and this is one of my Bibles, historical Bibles, if you will, not since that work have we really sort of had an opportunity to really sort of dive into these materials. Obviously, I know some other historians who are currently working on business histories and are at work and looking at some of the materials. In addition, just to give you some context on some of the other writings on Black Durham, again, these historians still were not able to really fully access the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives. You had O'Shea Gray Davidson's 1996 book, The Best of Enemies, Race and Redemption in the South, which he talks a little bit about some of the business history. It's recently been made into a movie starring Taraji Henson. Christina Green's Our Separate Ways, Women in the Black Freedom Movement in Durham, North Carolina, was published in 2005. Leslie Brown's work, Upbuilding Black Durham. Robert Korstad and James Ludis's To Right These Wrongs, the North Carolina Fund and the Battle to End Poverty and Inequality in the 1960s America. More recently, Jerry Gerstenhorn's Lewis Austin in the Carolina Times, A Life in the Long Black Freedom Struggle. I'm sure he made use of some of the company's archives as he wrote about this relationship between the Black newspaper editor Lewis Austin and his relationship with businesses like the North Carolina Mutual, right, which helped support and fund his publication of the newspaper. And then, of course, my work on John Harvey Wheeler. There's a recent biography on, it's called by Blake Hill Saya, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. It's about Aaron McDuffie Moore, an African-American physician, educator, and founder of Durham's Black Wall Street. I really haven't had an opportunity to dive into that work, but I'm sure that the author made use of those materials in the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives. And so, again, my point in sort of pointing to some of these works is there have been a few scholars that have been able to access these materials. And there are, again, a few Black business historians that are beginning to use these materials, but it's still a largely untapped archival resource, right? In terms of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives, as you can imagine, there's a lot of different kind of material in the collection, and I'm not going to go on and on because you can go to and look at the finding aid to see what's there. But from the perspective of someone who's interested in understanding using Black business as a way to understand the Black experience in the United States, the materials that really sort of that I go to and I'm interested in are things like photographs, news broadcasts, trade publications, company policies, company bylaws, newsletters, charters, conference proceedings, employee data, statements of condition, audio recording. And more recently, historians have begun to, there's a really, really great book about Madam C.J. Walker by Tyrone McKinley, I believe his name is, or Tyrone either McKinley or Freeman. I forget his last name. He is getting us to reconsider African-American business people, someone through the lens of Madam C.J. Walker, the broad scope of African-American philanthropy, right? And so one of the interesting things as you do this kind of work and you go into these archives, and particularly when there's material like a company or one of the business people has papers, what you find is there is a documentary record of their financial giving, right? And as you're in these materials, a lot of times it's hard to think about, understand how best to use these materials, but he's given us a framework really to sort of understand Black philanthropy in ways that we can put them on the same level as folks like Andrew Carnegie and other folks. But also Black philanthropy is more than just the sort of monetary gifts. There's so many ways that we should think about Black philanthropy, right? And so as historians doing Black business history, as we're moving forward, we're beginning to think about how to utilize that kind of material, really sort of provide and talk about the nuances of something like Black philanthropy. All right, you also have newspapers, correspondences, and obituaries. This page here that you see is from a 1949, I believe, issue of Ebony magazine, where West Paris Street, where the North Carolina Mutual's office building was located, they dubbed it the Wall Street of Negro America. And so really understanding, right, Durham as a Black Wall Street, right? And once you begin to sort of look at these Black Wall Streets, you really, part of what we have to begin to also do is talk about the tangible aspects of why these were considered Black Wall Streets, right? There was a Black Wall Street in Durham, Richmond. Obviously, you're familiar with Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Atlanta. So we began to sort of really articulate these places as Black Wall Streets, plural, right? And again, it's not simply that these are places where there was Black business, but these were centers. And by and large, there was a Black financial network. In the case of Durham, there was the Bankers Fire Insurance Company. There was a Mutual Building and Loan Association. There was the Southern Fidelity and Surety Company, right? And so you had a Black financial network in addition to the area known as Hayti, where you have residential areas and other Black businesses. But there was a thriving economic presence. And we think about sort of Black Wall Streets, right? We have to sort of remember that the economic underpinnings of these Black financial networks were at the forefront of why we consider these to be these sort of Black Wall Streets. Right. In addition to the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives, some of the other collections related to African Americans in Durham that really, and again, I was so familiar with these materials way before I kind of did some follow-up research toward the book, right, to gain access to North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company files. William Gaston Pearson papers, Charles Clinton Spalding. William Gaston Pearson was one of the foremost entrepreneurs in Durham. He was also the principal of the local Black Hillside High School. He was himself a philanthropist. He gave significant amounts of money and financial support to Kittrell College, which was an African Methodist Episcopal Church school in Vance County, North Carolina. Renter and Harris, I've talked about this earlier, Asa and Elder Spalding papers, Helen G. Edmonds, the historian, was a professor of history at North Carolina Central University. The John Avery Boys Club, Behind the Veil Oral History Project. So there, I would say the Franklin Research Center and the Rubenstein Library is I probably utilize the collections in these, I probably utilize these collections more than any other collection or library aside from the Atlanta University Center, Robert W. Woodruff Library, where the John Hervey Wheeler papers are actually located. So I continue to, again, utilize these materials. They're going to be really significant even for my current book project. All right, so let me give you some a kind of an overview of my first book, John Herbert Wheeler, Black Banking and Economic Struggle for Civil Rights, which was published in 2020 with University Press of Kentucky. And I'm grateful that it won one of the 2020 Lillian Smith Book Awards. Again, is a testament to the kind of support I had to be able to take on this kind of research. The book examines the relationship between Black business and civil rights through the public activism of banker lawyer John Herbert Wheeler, who was the president of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank between 1952 and 1978. The book argues in part that if we are to fully understand how central economics was to the civil rights movement, we must consider Black business. Wheeler, the most influential Black power broker in North Carolina in the mid-20th century, used his legal, political, and economic expertise to shape the region's future and make what I call New South prosperity possible on a larger scale through seeing that everyone, every Southerner, had an opportunity to make sure the region would prosper, grow, and survive amid the turmoil of the 1960s and beyond. So in the book, there's this is actually an earlier table of contents, right? So there are only 6 chapters in the book, but essentially, I tried to take this idea of New South prosperity that John Wheeler articulated over and over again as a sort of frame for understanding why, as a Black business person, he would be so interested in something like civil rights, in the broader civil rights movement. He articulated often that in this idea of New South prosperity, that in order for African Americans to have any kind of economic power, they would have to have all of their citizenship rights, their full citizenship rights, simultaneously, as a pathway to Black economic power, right? Where it's a bit different from how we understand Black business in the early part of the 20th century. When we think of people like Booker T. Washington, and we think about Madam C.J. Walker, in many instances, we know that someone like Washington was making the case that African Americans need to focus on their economic independence, their economic growth, taking part in Black enterprise first as a pathway to citizenship. And so in the first part of the 20th century, we understand Black business and the leadership from those individuals as focusing on that particular ideal. Well, someone like John Wheeler kind of flips that on its head. And he says that you couldn't have, there's no way you could have Black economic power if you didn't have all your citizenship rights. In other words, educational equality, housing opportunities, voting rights, public accommodations had a significant bearing on one's ability to access, or African Americans' ability to access economic power. That also impacted one's, what he called, freedom of movement. Where one worked, where one lived, had some bearing on their economic rights as citizens, right? And so John Herbert Wheeler really sort of he sort of shows us and gives us an example of why a Black business person will be so interested in civil rights, despite a sort of common myth that because of Jim Crow segregation, Black businesses like the North Carolina Mutual, like the Mechanics Farmers Bank, experience significant growth and economic prosperity because of Jim Crow, in terms of it creating these separate parallel institutions, these separate Black economy. Someone like John Wheeler argued the exact opposite. He made the case often that while yes, African-American businesses did thrive because of Black clientele, that Black clientele, those Black consumers, were not exclusive to African-American business. And so they always had to compete with their white counterparts, while their white counterparts really didn't have to compete with Black companies for white customers. And so John Wheeler made the case that if given an opportunity, a bank like the Mechanics and Farmers Bank could compete in a larger marketplace with any other institutions of comparable size. And so for him, we had to do away with Jim Crow segregation. And so part of his involvement dealt with the citizenship rights of African Americans, but he was also thinking about the future survival of Black institutions, Black educational institutions, Black business institutions as well. Right. And I'll be happy during Q&A to answer some additional questions about John Herbert Wheeler. Just real quickly, John Wheeler, 1935, 1978, was on the boards of trustees at Morehouse University and Atlanta University. He was also a civil rights lawyer, litigated one of the first successful educational challenges to the educational inequality with the Blue v. Durham case beginning in 1949. He was, again, one of the foremost civil rights leader in North Carolina during the mid 1950s through the 1960s. Had an appointment on the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. He was forerunner to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission under the Kennedy administration, and then with the Johnson administration. And also was the first Black delegate to represent North Carolina as a delegate to the National Democratic Party in 1964, right? All right, so again, I was interested in the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company archives in terms of, how I proposed when I got the travel grant, interested in exploring some of the early history of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, particularly for my first chapter that really sort of looked at John Wheeler's family background, his mother and father. And so I knew that once I had access to these materials, I knew there was going to be a lot about the life and business career of John Wheeler's father, who you see pictured here, John Leonidas Wheeler. I also knew and was interested in examining material related to the Mechanics and Farmers Bank in particular, and then Black banking more generally. I was also interested in examining the North Carolina Mutual's main internal publication, which was called the Whetstone. And then also, aside from that, I was interested in Black economic life and the ways in which these business records could not only inform Black economic life, but inform all aspects of the larger African-American experience in the South and also throughout the United States. When we look into these kinds of records, we get to see, your eyes are really open to the interconnectedness of Black institutions, right? So you understand how a company like North Carolina Mutual certainly connected to those Black financial institutions in Durham, because many of those same folks who were responsible for starting the North Carolina Mutual started other institutions. But you also begin to understand that there was a significant network, a larger Black business network, right? Where you see Black business people in Durham and Richmond having really close relationships in terms of their support for one another, in terms of this sort of cross-fertilization between these institutions. And moreover, we get to see how central the North Carolina Mutual is one of the largest Black businesses in the United States, how central it was to the broader world of Black business, both nationally and even from an international perspective. And so again, this archives is probably one of the foremost archives for exploring Black business, not just in Durham, but in the United States more generally, right? So it's really, really a game changer for business historians and for folks like me who are looking at this kind of history. All right, so what are some of the archival finds for some of the things that, or in other words, how did it go in terms of my interest and what I was interested in terms of kind of what I found when I looked at some of the materials, and I knew exactly what I was going to find. And so I was surprised and not surprised in some things. And I have a little, one particular source that I was really sort of excited about. In the archival find, though, one of the documents in this collection was the Mutual album that was published in 1909, and it really sort of chronicled the North Carolina Mutual's first decade in operation. And so in that album, you have a pictorial history of the company, right? Where it operated, right? And so in Atlanta, you'll see images of those folks who were running the Atlanta office, the home office, both men and women who were a part of the North Carolina Mutuals, the North Carolina Mutual family, right? And so, so this image here to the right is of John Leonidas Wheeler, right? So this is an image that comes directly from the Mutual album. John Leonidas Wheeler had been, he and his wife, Margaret Hervey Wheeler, were both from Lexington, Kentucky. They both attended, were early graduates of Wilberforce University. John Leonidas graduated around 1897. A year later, by 1898, which is a well-known year in North Carolina, right, with the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot, the chartering of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, John Leonidas comes to North Carolina as an educator. He began working, he and his wife Margaret, as teachers for what was then Kittrell College, which again was a college that was controlled by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so for a decade, they both taught at Kittrell College. John Leonidas eventually becomes the president of Kittrell College. And then before coming to Durham to work for North Carolina Mutual in 1908. Also in the materials of William Gaston Pearson, who was again a supporter of Kittrell College, there are all of these catalogs of Kittrell College, catalogs that detail the curriculum and everything that you can imagine when it comes to these catalogs. And so these materials also gave me a good sense of how to really sort of use them to talk about the history of Kittrell College as I contextualize the Wheelers coming to North Carolina and working at Kittrell College. In the bottom right is an image, not from the collections at Rubenstein Library. This is an image that was from a publication from Harvard University. But this is an image of the Wheeler family, really Margaret Hervey's parents, who you see at the top. In this middle line of pictures, to the left, you see John Leonidas Wheeler, and you see his wife, Margaret Hervey Wheeler. And then if you look at the bottom right, you see an image of a young John Hervey Wheeler, and then his two sisters as well. And so again, this is one of the archival finds. A Mutual album really helped contextualize the life of John Leonidas for me, as I had done a bunch of writing about his life. But again, I hadn't accessed the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company papers, and I knew those materials would broaden my understanding of his life and career. And so John Leonidas resigns from Kittrell College around 1908 as president. He comes to work for the North Carolina Mutual, and he works as an insurance agent with the Raleigh branch. He eventually takes over the Raleigh offices, and then he's called to the home office, where he becomes the bookkeeper. And so one of the documents that was really fascinating was he kept a scrapbook, right? If you see at the bottom right of that scrapbook, you see his initials there. In this scrapbook, filled with a lot of things, right? Newspaper articles, like the one you see pictured here about him speaking at an event. Newspaper articles that detail really sort of his involvement with the company. And there are also a bunch of photographs, right? There are articles written by other North Carolina Mutual officers. One article, for instance, was written by one of the officers, not even remembering his name right now, where he chronicles and details in his newspaper article the North Carolina Mutual's emergence or their establishment of offices in the state of Georgia. And so he tells these stories of John Merrick's son, E.R. Merrick, who was one of the earliest field agents in Georgia. And he travels throughout Georgia, and on several occasions he is arrested, right? Because it was kind of unusual to see a Black traveling businessman during these particular times. And so you have these fascinating stories that are included in some of these newspaper articles. These are just some, I'm not going to go through all of these documents, but to the left is a newsletter written by John L. Wheeler, right? When he becomes supervisor over the Georgia region and Atlanta offices, he writes to his agents, right? And he details some of the policies for those local agents. In the middle, again, some of the materials that come from both the scrapbook and other areas of the collections. In the middle, there's a testimonial dinner for when he retired from North Carolina Mutual as an officer in 1950. And then to the far right is an actual transcript of someone giving a testimonial as his retirement dinner. So it provided a really great and rich sense of who he was, right? How others looked at him and viewed him during this particular time. And so it opened up a way for me to really talk about both John Leonidas and Margaret Hervey Wheeler, who was an educator in her own right. She taught at Kittrell, but she also before they could go to public schools, she taught her children, all three of them. She was also involved with the orphans home in Atlanta. So she was also a civic leader in her own right. Right. All right. So now this, again, one of the other mediums or publications I was really interested in is the Wet Zone. In the Wet Zone is everything you need to know about the company during this particular period, particularly if you're an employee of the company. But it also captures and details everything that was happening in the community in terms of in Durham and surrounding areas. And so not only do you get the business aspect of things, but you also get to hear and read about all of the other interesting events that were taking place during this particular time. And so I have one of my favorite finds was a WRAL broadcast of the North Carolina Mutual's groundbreaking ceremony in Durham in 1963. The building was completed in 1966. And so I'm going to go let you listen to a few snippets of the broadcast. And so one of the things that was really sort of interesting about this is that I had heard oral histories of John Hervey Wheeler and his voice, but this is really the first time that I had actual footage of John Hervey Wheeler speaking. And so having spent all that time doing research on him and looking at all of these documents and photographs and materials and having some oral histories, but to see him in the flesh giving a public address was really sort of a euphoric moment. And I'm going to play some of that.
Proper with leads and parts for those who would build high. First must be learned the skill of digging deep. We recall it to mind because it seems appropriate in the telling of a special story tonight. It's a story of vision and purpose, a story of resolve and hard work, of trial and error, but more importantly, a story of what can be achieved here in America, here in the Southland by the American Negro, who first sets a goal and then strikes out for it along the road of hard work and persistence. Today, this shovel was used to begin the foundation of a new building, which will soon grace the city of Durham. Also modern in architecture, surrounded by a terraced garden and fountain, this 12-story structure will soon become the new home of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. It is this company and its personnel the WRAL-TV salutes tonight. There's something about this company that sets it apart, makes it distinct among the more than 1,400 other insurance companies in America. It was founded by a group of Negroes, built by Negroes, and it has become the largest Negro financial institution not only in the United States, but the entire world. And it happened not in the North or West, but here in the Southland, where population figures have always shown the Negro in the minority. Later in this program, we will show you excerpts from today's groundbreaking ceremonies. But first, it is my pleasure to present with a special message the president of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, Dr. Asa P. Spaulding.
Thank you, Mr. Buick, for this opportunity to share with your WRAL TV audience some of our reflections and feelings on this rather significant occasion, not only in the history of our company, but also of our city, state, and nation. North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company is more than a commercial organization. It is a symbol of Negro enterprise, faith, courage, initiative, industry, determination, perseverance, and integrity. It is the largest Negro-owned operating management business in the world, and is a shining example of what can happen in America. Among the more than 1,400 life insurance companies operating in this country, North Carolina Mutual ranks in the first two.
I'm going to stop that share. It looked like it wasn't coming in clear, like it was skipping a beat. Sorry about this. Give me 1 second. There we go. I couldn't find my my clicker. All right, bear with me. There we go. I'm going to skip to John Herbie Wheeler. Should be around the 17-minute mark.
The businesses and for their continued prosperity and success.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Mayor Evans. Also bringing greetings from the government, both state and county, were the Honorable Edwin F. Lanier, Commissioner of Insurance for the state of North Carolina, and the Honorable George F. Kirkland, who is Chairman of the Durham County Board of Commissioners. Among those affiliated with businesses and industries who appeared on the program was Mr. J.H. Wheeler, who is President of the Merchants and Farmers Bank. Mr. Wheeler.
The breaking of ground for this magnificent new structure is of such unusual importance in the affairs of our community, state, and nation that those who bring greetings on this historic occasion wish not only to rejoice with you for the blessings which have attended the growth of an enterprise with which you and those who have gone before have been entrusted. We wish also to break bread together with you on our knees, asking the ruler of the universe to keep our footsteps forever in the paths of unselfish service to God and man.
We could have said that Mr. Wheeler is...
All right, it won't let me be great, but you get the idea. And here's a cover image of the Whetstones publication in the second quarter of 1963, which you see some of the officials of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company in this groundbreaking ceremony. And so the story is chronicled in that issue. And so all the speeches of the folks who you saw in this video are captured in this particular issue. So John Wheeler's speech, I had his speech before I actually had this particular video. So that was for me really cool to have that kind of broadcast found, and then having the library make a listening copy and then sending me a digital copy of it was just really sort of exciting for me as a researcher. All right, so I'm running out of time, but some of the other really great archival finds in North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company files is, yes, it's an insurance company, but it also had its investments in other businesses. And so there's a lot of material that I knew I was going to find, and I did find. related to Black banking. For example, this is a 6th annual report of banking institutions owned and operated by Negroes, published by the Department of Commerce. And this is, and some of what we see here with this particular document is, you see I have highlighted or circled the only woman officer of what was the National Bankers Association, the National Negro Bankers Association, was Nettie B. Archer, who was assistant vice president of the Citizens Trust Bank in Atlanta, Georgia. And so in my next current book project, I get the opportunity to talk a little bit more about women bankers like Nettie B. Archer. You also have what are called statements of conditions, these financial reports for these for Black banks. You have the Crown Savings Bank in Newport News, Virginia. You have the Citizens Trust Company in Atlanta, Georgia, the Industrial Bank of Washington, D.C., and then the Tri-State Bank of Memphis, just a few examples of those statements of condition. Also, you have a number of statements of condition for the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. And so with these documents, yes, you get a telling of the financials of the companies, but you also get a list of the board of directors, the officers of the company, right? And so it really sort of opens up other opportunities to explore the history of these institutions. And one of the things that I am doing with these statements of conditions in these annual reports is I'm making tables of, for each of these institutions, as many as I can, tables that capture the history of the boards of directors for many of these institutions. So you can use these materials to create your own kind of sources, in this way, tables, which I'm really excited about. All right, so I'll end by really sort of talking a little bit about my current book project, and I'll be happy to answer questions. I really can't give everything that I had planned for this piece of it, but really quickly, I'm really sort of writing a more of a comprehensive history of Black banking in the American South. It is tentatively titled Our Good Fortune, A History of Black Banking in the American South. And so it is really going to sort of argue that the everyday activities and rhythms inside the Black bank have not always been recognized for what they might tell us about community. Nevertheless, Black banking as an institution, it became an important space where race, class, gender, institution building, and reciprocity regularly played out. The Black bank as an institution was filled with hope, drama, tragedy, celebration, disappointment, misunderstanding, strategy, growth, and democracy. These sites of Black economic life represented the possibilities and strivings of Black people and contributed to a thriving separate Black economy. These financial institutions offered real and imagined pathways toward Black economic independence. They provided a network of Black banks, or a network of Black banks also trained generations of Black banking professionals, and it supported the establishment of new banks across the region. In particular, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many of those Black banking professionals integrate the broader field of banking. They go into white banking institutions. Yet the history of Black banking begs to be examined on its own terms, not merely in relation to white banks. And so Our Good Fortune, again, explores the rise of Black financial capitals in the making of particular New South cities from the late 19th century onward. In the decades after emancipation, the majority of Black banks opened in the American South. They represent an important feature in the Southern Black experience, especially after the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision. The Great Depression, however, forced all but a handful of these institutions into insolvency. And so part of our conversation when we talk about the Black banking history is we talk in many ways about the limitations, right, and their failures, especially when we consider the Great Depression. But we don't talk enough about the nuances, the complexities of those institutions, the history, the backgrounds of these institutions. We don't talk about them enough. And so that's what I'm hoping to do with this book. And I'll show you one last image. The image to the right is from actually the C.C. Spalding papers, another really great find. It is the inside lobby of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, which operated on the first floor of the NC Mutual building, which you see pictured here. It was completed in 1961. And and just to give you a sense of the book that I'm writing, I want to capture in this book everything that you see here in this particular image, right? If you look to the left, you see those, the employees of the bank behind the teller cages. If you look in the middle, you see the bank's most important asset, the depositors. You see two Black women domestics in the back of the line. You see what looks to be maybe a farmer or mechanic in the front of the line. And then up to the far right, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see some of the officers of the bank. In particular, you see John Herbie Wheeler in the right-hand corner. And this gentleman, this white-haired gentleman is actually C.C. Spalding, who's the president of the North Carolina Mutual and the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, right? And so finally, just to give you an idea of some of my publications that I'm currently working on, I have a 2016 article from this research in the North Carolina Historical Review. I have a current article under review for the Journal of African American History called Large Enough to Serve You, Small Enough to Know You, the Mechanics Farmers Bank and Black Banking Networks in the American South. And I'm already thinking about a third project that's again informed by the research that I was able to do with the Franklin Research Center grant. And that is provisionally titled The Wall Street of Negro America, West Paris Street, and the Black Financial Network in Durham, North Carolina. All right, and so I'm happy to take questions and thank you again for your patience and for being here today.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I really appreciate you sharing your research and particularly all the findings that you were able to identify in the Mutual Archive and your time researching here in the Research Center and in the Rubenstein Library. I'm going to kick it over to Ori and ask her to read off a few of the comments or a few of the questions, excuse me, from our attendees today.
Sure.
Yes. So our first question is, what was the impact of antitrust laws on Black businesses?
Impact of antitrust laws on Black business. That's actually a really, really great question. I haven't really explored the impact of antitrust laws on particularly North Carolina Mutual and other businesses. I'm more familiar with the Duke family and everything that happens with American Tobacco. But that's something I really haven't looked at. So I really can't give you a really great answer on that front, but it's definitely something that I perhaps can explore with this current book project a little more, right? I don't have a really good answer for you. I haven't really explored the antitrust laws. Really, really great question though.
Okay. Our next question is, the person says, thank you for a wonderful presentation, very interesting research. It is interesting that Wheeler believed ending segregation was key to the survival of Black-owned institutions. It seems as though integration hindered the growth of these institutions for many decades after 1964. What are your thoughts?
Really, really great question. Again, a lot of the myths surrounding Black business was, again, that these business people, because the companies experienced success, that they thrived during Jim Crow, and for those reasons didn't fully support integration. And again, with the example of Wheeler and others, the exact opposite was true. Now, for John Herbie Wheeler, and it wasn't just about the survival of an institution like the Mechanics Farmers Bank, the North Carolina Mutual. John Wheeler was a believer in Black institutions. He believed that if given the opportunity, given access to the broader society, these Black institutions could succeed, right? And he believed with the coming of integration, he didn't foresee the abandonment of Black-owned institutions. And so he really felt like integration was going to strengthen, believe it or not, Black-owned institutions. Obviously, that was not the case, right? In particular, when we look at the example of Black institutions in terms of educational institutions, what we saw was basically a sort of watering down of and traditions of these Black institutions, and a sort of throwing Black children into previously all white schools, really sort of abandoning the traditions of these Black-owned institutions. And in many ways, we also have to think about sort of the Black consumers, right? The Black consumers with the coming of integrations, as they gained access to larger companies that could provide perhaps other kinds of services that Black-owned institutions and businesses couldn't. We see the consumer base really sort of leave. And the Mechanics and Farmers Bank and North Carolina Mutual, they struggle, right, with that very same thing, in addition to not just Black consumers, but and Black employees, right? Many of them who left these institutions to go to formerly all-white institutions. In the case of, and so that was definitely a concern. You know, Walter Weir writes about North Carolina Mutual really sort of not necessarily abandoning its identity, but changing the ways in which it talked about its identity to essentially gain access to these larger marketplaces after with the coming of integration with the civil rights movement, the gains of the civil rights movement, and so forth and so on. In the case of Mechanics and Farmers Bank, John Wheeler, and you can talk to folks who were on the board or were employed by the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, John Wheeler made sure that, first of all, most of these Black-owned institutions, particularly Mechanics and Farmers Bank, were didn't take a lot of risks from that particular standpoint, because taking risks for these kinds of institutions could really make or break these institutions. And so the Mechanics and Farmers Bank didn't take a whole lot of risk in terms of its lending practices and so forth and so on. But also, even with integration, John Wheeler wanted to make sure that this institution remained a Black-owned bank. When board members or stockholders died, he made sure that those stocks were purchased by other Black stockholders. And so he really wanted this to maintain its identity as a Black-owned institution, and was unapologetic about that. Also, we have to consider, and I write about this in my last chapter of the book, we also have to consider the impact of public policies like urban renewal, right? Urban renewal did significant damage to the Black community as an entity, right? And so Black businesses, residential areas, the community itself was disrupted. And so that had a lot to do with some of the disruptions we think of sort of Black businesses in the face of integration. So that's sort of one way to sort of think about that. John Wheeler was on the Durham Redevelopment Commission that oversaw urban renewal in Durham. He was criticized as the reality of urban renewal in terms of it being Negro removal. Once the reality of it set in, he was criticized, right, for selling the Black community down the river. In this chapter that when I deal with urban renewal, I try to make sure that we also talk about the nuance and complexities of someone like John Wheeler. So in the Black community, the Durham Committee and Black leaders supporting, people like Lewis Austin supported urban renewal, right, because of the possibilities. And if we look at John Wheeler's records and the records of some of these other leaders, I push back on the notion that they intentionally sold the Black community down the river is kind of what you hear. And so I'm interested in part of what we can do in telling these new histories of Black business is we can complicate this narrative, right? And understand the motivations, understand more broadly some of the public policies at work that also went into the disruptions of Black institutions and Black business. One of the things that we don't talk enough about is the emergence of the Research Triangle Park and its impact on Black Durham as well, right? As urban renewal was displacing African-Americans, the Research Triangle Park, the highway that went to the heart of Black Durham, was making a way for outsiders, many of them white, to come work in the Research Triangle Park, all right? So we have to talk about not only, what the impact of integration, but also what were some of those policies that, intentional or not, disrupted the continuance and survival of many of these institutions. A long way to answer a really great question, but those are some of the ways in which we can think about the impact of integration on Black business.
And the last question is wondering if you could speak to the relationship between FHA and Black insurance companies.
Really, really great question. So the FHA, so the North Carolina, the Mechanics Farmers Bank was in North Carolina, the first institution, white or Black, to get approval to start issuing FHA loans, which is in some ways partly responsible for the emergence of or increase in Black home ownership in Durham. The North Carolina Mutual, as you can imagine, right, was also a part of that in the sense that Black potential homeowners could not, again, get loans from their white counterparts. It was institutions like the North Carolina Mutual and the Mechanics Farmers Bank that demonstrated to their white counterparts that Black borrowers were not as risky as they might have thought, right, in terms of home loans and so forth and so on, right? But these institutions, particularly in North Carolina, were at the forefront in making the case and utilizing these FHA loans. As you're quite aware, even when we get to World War II and post-World War II, even with the emergence of the GI Bill and all the investments that the federal government was placing, was making, were providing Americans during this particular period. Obviously, of course, African Americans didn't benefit in the ways that their white counterpart, right? Whether we're talking about war veterans who could take advantage of the GI Bill, right? Could get these FHA loans, but if you didn't have a Black bank or a Black financial institution like Mechanics Farmers Bank, North Carolina Mutual, the Mutual Building and Loan Association, right? It was going to be difficult for African Americans. It was difficult for African Americans to take advantage of those FHA loans, right? So part of what my broader research is really sort of looking into is what, we talk a lot about these failures of these institutions, but what does it look like in the instance of FHA? What does it look like when there is an institution that can provide and take advantage of those that government financing, right? What does that look like in comparison to a community that perhaps didn't have a Black-owned bank or didn't have any Black-owned insurance or Black-owned or Black financial institution in operation, right? Part of what I'm really sort of interested in, what I'm really sort of looking at and exploring, and I hope to do more work in really sort of specifying that relationship between these Black institutions and the FHA. John Wheeler, particularly during the 1950s and 1960s, was adamant, as were other Black business people, were adamant in making the case for housing rights because he felt like in the same way that having a job was an important right, having access to education was an important right, housing really became something that he felt should be an important right for citizens, right? This is partly why he supports urban renewal. Urban renewal, it disrupted community, but for John Wheeler, it was going to force Durham to allow African Americans to move into other parts of the city, right? Again, those are some of the ways in which he understood it, but it didn't really sort of pan out like that. We also see in the late 1960s, the Mechanics Farmers Bank again, working closely with the North Carolina Fund, right, to set up low-income housing development corporations throughout North Carolina, right? Those programs forced banks like Wachovia and others to again revisit their policies as it relates to African Americans. And so these institutions really challenged those larger white institutions to make their resources more accessible to African Americans, right? A really, really great question, and haven't done as much as I'd like on the way of housing in the first book, but I hope to really sort of really do some groundbreaking work and really sort of capturing that relationship in this next book project. And I should note that I'm at the beginning of this next book project. Still really doing a lot of the research. I have a book proposal, but I really haven't done the meat core of that research yet. So I'm just really sort of at the very beginning of that.
Great. And there's just one last question that got popped into the chat, which says, we have all this information on these intentional hardships placed upon Blacks and their businesses. What is being done to repair the damages?
Ooh, that is a great question. What I'll do is I'll point you to a recent book by Kristen Mullins and Sandy Darity. I forget, give me 1 second. I have the book right here. Well, I thought I had it. Oh, here it is. Sorry about that. From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 20th Century. I encourage you to pick up a copy of that book. And so part of this, the reparative justice aspects of Black economic life is at the forefront of their work. And so there really is a renewed effort, right, in really sort of rethinking the kinds of policies that need to happen in the contemporary moment in order for Black businesses to not only survive, but to provide opportunities for entrepreneurs to be innovative in creating new opportunities for themselves. But many historians, business historians in particular, argue that it's going to take a significant federal government public policy initiative in order for that to happen. And part of that is because of the ways in which there was a government or public policy effort to ensure that Black business didn't, for example, have access to capital in the ways that they needed to, or in the on a wider scale that they needed. So those kinds of initiatives need to happen. Now, one of the things that is happening in our contemporary moment is you do have, so we talk a lot about kind of the challenges which are there, right? There's still a problem of capital for Black business and accessing capital. But there are efforts by entrepreneurs. There is an African-American woman, I can't remember her name, and she funds startup companies. So entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs who have great ideas but don't have the capital. So in other words, there are a lot of innovative initiatives and strategies that are taking place. We sometimes forget what is happening along those lines. Some of the things that are happening, we think of sort of kind of a reparative justice. You have companies like Wells Fargo, right? Netflix pledging to redistribute $100 million into Black-owned banks. Wells Fargo pledging to hire more banking professionals after their CEO made a false comment that there were not enough trained African Americans to take on the leadership roles in management for a company like Wells Fargo, right? We just saw the merger of two of the largest Black-owned banks in the country, right? With resources well over, just over $1 billion. We had recently Ambassador Andrew Young and Mike Render, the rapper Killer Mike. They've established a fintech company, Greenwood Financial, right? Using the sort of legacy of these Black Wall Streets, Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So you do have these initiatives that are taking place. One other thing that we don't talk enough about is, and I'll use the example, and I'll end right here. I'll use the example of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, whose motto at one time was large enough to serve you, small enough to know you. When COVID happened, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank and its president, James Seals, they really did in my opinion, did a really, really good job of reasserting their identity as a minority depository institution, letting their customers, their depositors know that they were still large enough to serve you, small enough to know you, but they continue to have a mission that's community oriented. And the bank held workshops for small businesses to show them how to access CARE Act funds. So I believe they did a really good job of reasserting their identity while at the same time coming up with different ways to impact the community, while at the same time bringing in new depositors. I think recently one of the things that they did has been a challenge for Black-owned banks was their ATMs for their customers. They have cooperative relationship with national banks to where their customers can go to the ATMs at I forget which bank it is, but you can access those ATMs as opposed to, for Mechanics and Farmers Bank, you can't set up an account outside of North Carolina. I set up an account, but I don't think it was set up really for folks living outside of North Carolina. I set up a savings account, and it kind of I feel like it was an exception to the rule, but they're doing new things to really sort of position themselves to pivot as we sort of find ourselves with all kinds of challenges that we're facing related to race and inequalities in the country. Really, really great question.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I'm gonna jump in and again, really appreciate the presentation and the information that you shared and taking questions from our audience. I just dropped a bunch of links in the chat, and I just wanted to walk through. If you want to learn more about the Franklin Research Center, there's a link there. If you want to learn more about our events for the 25th anniversary, our next event is going to be on October the 27th. We'll be joined by Lisa Bratton from Tuskegee University, who was another travel grant awardee. And we'll be giving a lecture with her research findings here in the center. If you would like to support the Franklin Research Center, whether that's through donating collections or through funds, there's a link there. I wanted to also share the link to the North Carolina Mutual Archives. Brandon mentioned that there are layers upon layers of research projects just in one archive, and that's absolutely true. The archive is jointly owned by Duke and North Carolina Central. It's a really unique relationship between the two of us. So you can access the collection either in the Rubenstein Library Reading Room or the reading room at the James E. Shepherd Memorial Library at North Carolina Central's campus. The collection is housed at our Library Service Center, and it goes to both places. And then we did an exhibit on Mutual in 2013 to celebrate, I believe it was 95th anniversary at the time. If you want to learn more, just see some of the documents and items in the collection there. I definitely encourage you to check out the link to the exhibition. So I really appreciate all of you for joining us this afternoon. And I hope to see you next month for our next lecture on the 27th of October. So thanks again, and you all take care.